Alrighty. Well, in the interest of time, we might make a start. So, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see some new uh, faces or names in our monthly lunch and learn session. So, I'm Vaughan Parsons. I'm the centre manager at the London Centre for Work and Health. And as you're mostly aware, we run these monthly lunch and learn sessions, and it's really an opportunity for our colleagues to come along and talk about their research projects. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jo Feary. Jo is one of our theme leads for respiratory diseases and work research. That's activity that's being undertaken in the centre, and she's going to be discussing some pioneering research that's been underway, specifically looking at artificial stonework. So, Joan, I'll hand over to you. And just to let everyone know, we do record these sessions, and we will be making this available on our website in the coming days. And we'll take questions at the end. So thanks, Jo.
Thanks, Vaughan. And it's a pleasure to be here presenting. I will say this is quite a clinical talk because it's quite difficult to talk about the subject without talking about the people who are affected and taking quite a clinical angle. But I'm going to try and make it as accessible as I can for the non-clinicians who are listening. So just a bit, let me just get my slides sorted. Just a bit of background to start with. So silica is a type of rock, it's silicon dioxide, and it is highly prevalent around the Earth. It forms a substantial part of the Earth's crust. And when it is cut, you get something called freshly fractured crystalline silica. And if it is small enough, it becomes respirable, so it can penetrate deep into your lungs. And we call that freshly fractured RCS. And this is what causes all the problems associated with lung disease. And we don't really know how many people are exposed globally, but around about 10 million are estimated to be exposed in India alone, 2 million in Brazil. There are probably 50 million artisanal and small-scale miners globally who are exposed to silica, and there are estimates for about 2.6 million cases of silicosis, so a lung disease arising from RCS around the world, but this is likely to be a huge underestimation. The only data that we have from the UK, as far as I know, is that there's model data from about 30 years ago suggesting that 600,000 people are exposed to silica in the UK, but that's an estimation based on modelling. So sand, you can see in that lovely beach on the top corner, is made up of a high content of silica, but you don't get silicosis from lying on the beach because it's not freshly fractured, it's not ground up, and you can't breathe it into your lungs. It's too old, it's rounded, and the particles are too large. But if you look at these photographs on the bottom, you've got some quarry workers in Rajasthan, and they're drilling through sandstone. It'll be very high content of silica, and the dust that is generated can penetrate into their lungs and cause silicosis. We have somebody working with an angle grinder in the middle, wearing some respiratory protection. And again, he's at risk of breathing in silica dust and getting silicosis. And we have a denim sandblaster on the bottom right-hand corner, and more about that in a minute. So silicosis is caused by breathing in RCS, and we classify it in two ways. We classify it based on the radiology, so the imaging that we get when we do a chest X-ray or CT scan, and by the length of time it takes or the amount of exposure that you need to develop it. So these are the two sort of probably most common forms of silicosis, and we call these chronic silicosis. And these come on historically, we think about 10 to 20 years after exposure, but often you need many more years than that, so 20, 30 years of exposure. And in the first column here, we have a simple silicosis. So the chest X-ray, if you look carefully, there are a few tiny little nodules or dots in the airways. And if you do a CT scan, you've got the hopefully you can see my pointer, left lung here, right lung here, and it looks a little bit more spotty than you might expect. And those spots are nodules of silica with some inflammation around them, which have formed these hard lumps in the lungs, and that is silicosis. And this person will have no respiratory symptoms, and their lung function will be normal. But if their simple silicosis progresses, they then go on to develop complicated silicosis or progressive massive fibrosis. And you have coalescence of the nodules up in the top of the lungs in the apices here on the right, and even more so on the left. And you can see that quite clearly here on the chest x-ray too. So this is complicated silicosis. This person may complain of breathlessness, and they may have a cough, and they may lose weight. And their lung function will be slightly reduced. So if you're doing lung function on them, you will see perhaps an abnormality. So as I said, this is these diseases usually come on after at least 10 years of exposure. But if you get this pattern of disease occurring in under 10 years of exposure, you call that accelerated silicosis. And then we have acute silicoproteinosis. So this is disease which comes on usually within 5 years of exposure, but certainly, yes, usually within 5 years of exposure. And radiologically, it looks very different. You get this fluffy shadowing at the bases of the lungs now instead of at the top. And if you do a CT scan, you get this grey pattern rather than the very white nodules that you saw on the other images. And that's caused by inflammation. And if we wash out this person's lungs, they'll have a lot of what we call lymphocytes, a particular white cell count that is filling the lungs. And these people are generally sick, they're breathless. They might report chest pain, they may have a cough, they will lose weight, and they're at risk of high mortality. And it's much less common. In addition to silicosis, silica exposure is also associated with rheumatological conditions and connective tissue disease. It's associated with COPD or emphysema. It's been a class 1 carcinogen since 1997, so it causes lung cancer. It's closely associated with TB infection, and because TB often looks like silicosis on imaging, and the symptoms can be same, there's often misclassification. So somebody's told they've got TB when actually they've got silicosis, or indeed people can have co-infection. And it's associated with renal disease, kidney disease, dermatitis, and also nuisance dust exposure. So there are countless examples of silicosis which have occurred throughout history. I think it was actually first described probably by Hippocrates over 2,000 years ago. And there have been industrial disasters throughout history which have centred on outbreaks of silicosis. And this is one of the most common ones, or most well-known ones, I should say, from the last century. So the Hawks Nest tunnel disaster happened in the 1930s in the peak of the Depression in America. And it was a hydroelectric project that happened in West Virginia. And I've put the names of the companies who were the masterminds up here, mainly because to point out to those of you who know anything about Union Carbide, so they were responsible for the Bhopal tragedy in 1984 in India. And here is the company again causing problems in another continent. And the project was to divert the New River through the Gawley Mountain to provide hydroelectric power to this plant in West Virginia. And it required construction of a 3-mile tunnel through this mountain. It was the 1930s. There were a lot of economic migrants, and migrants came over to West Virginia to do this work, and about 3,000 came in total. 75% of them were Black. And they were working 10 to 15-hour shifts mining sandstone through this mountain to build this tunnel. And there are reports, for example, of them not being allowed to take breaks and then being sort of worked at gunpoint. They weren't provided with any respiratory protection of any sorts, and no masks. But when the management came round to visit, they were all provided with respiratory protection. So that tells you a little bit about how they were valued and they were treated. And the estimate number of deaths from silicosis in these workers range from 109 to over 1,000, so maybe a third of them. And they will have died from acute and accelerated disease because it occurred within, they only had working there for 5 years. So we would classify that as an acute and accelerated disease. And they would have had extremely high exposures to sandstone, which has very high silica content, which penetrated in their lungs, causing this disease. And it's known as one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. Moving forward, a century, we have a similar outbreak of acute and accelerated disease in Turkish denim sand blasters. So these are small workplaces in Turkey where they had very high exposures to silica, and they use sand to sandblast denim to create a distressed look for companies, that are well known for their denim manufacture. And then these are workers who you can see they've got very rudimentary respiratory protection, just a mask across their face, and they are blasting out at high velocity sand. And because sand contains high contents of silica, and it fractures because it's being blasted out at such high velocity and hitting the denim, and they're breathing it in. So one report from 2007 of 145 men showed that there were 16 cases of accelerated silicosis that occurred in under 2 years. Mean age was 23. Mean duration of exposure for all the cases was 3 years. And the prevalence in that cohort was about 56% at the time. Fast forward 4 years, 96% of the workers in that population who could be traced had silicosis, 6.2% had died, and most of them had radiological progression. So even though they were no longer exposed, the disease was still getting worse. And I think it was banned in Turkey around about 15 years ago, the processing. I'd say, though, the processing just got moved east into Southeast Asia rather than being done in Turkey. Right, so where are we with artificial stone? So many of you be aware of sort of things that have been discussions that have been had about artificial stone over the last couple of years. So artificial stone is a new product that was introduced around about 1990s. And it's a product that is made up of finely crushed rock, so different forms of silica, quartz and cristobalite, and it's bonded together with resins, metal oxides and pigments. And it's used primarily for kitchen worktops, but also for bathroom fittings and skirting boards and other fixtures. And people like it because it's highly resilient and it has lots of aesthetic qualities, which means it can match your kitchen and you can make it in whatever colour you want. It's easy to process because there are no natural imperfections, and so there's less wastage because you don't need to cut your stone around sort of natural veins. And because it's easy to process, it can be carried out by low-skilled workers, and that creates its own problems. The slabs themselves are manufactured in different countries around the world. I think primarily China at the moment, but also Spain, Israel, Italy, and the US. It dominates the market, so 55% of the market share in Australia a couple of years ago was down to artificial stone, and the global market is valued at $25 billion. And I think the UK market, it's got a pretty sizable share as well. So why does artificial stone cause problems? So the first thing is that it has very, very high silica content. So you can see this table from the HSC guidelines. If you start at the bottom, marble has less than 2% silica content and granite has 30%. So if you've only ever processed worktops made out of marble and granite, your chances of having significant RCS exposure are it's there, but are much more limited. Whereas if you go up to the top, you can see sandstones, very close to the top at 70 to 90%, but engineered stone can contain up to 95% silica. So very high silica content. When you process it, it's already made up of crushed up rock, so you have ultrafine particles that are produced that you can't even see and that penetrate your lung. And then it comes down to this problem of processing. So because it's easy to process, you can use hand tools like this angle grinder, and you can process it dry. And this is data from a time-weighted average from a period of monitoring. And it showed that if you dry process this stone, it generates 44 milligrams per cubic meter of respirable crystalline silica. If you dry process it and you decide to use water suppression, that comes down to just 10% of that, so 4.9. And if you wet process it plus use local exhaust ventilation, it comes down to 0.6. But just for a reminder, the UK work exposure limit is 0.1 milligrams per cubic meter. So when you process it, you have even with water suppression and local exhaust ventilation, you still have exposures that are well over the workplace exposure limit. And a reminder that the UK's workplace exposure limit is double that in Australia of that in Australia. And so it's being processed in all sorts of some situations that I'll talk about in a second. So artificial stone silicosis was first described in Italy in 2010, with subsequent case series reported from other countries around the world. And if we just take Australia as a case in point, in 2015 they had their first case, 2018 they had 7 cases, and by 2022 they had over 500 cases. And this was after a really proactive screening programme and media campaign that was carried out in 2020 and 2021 in response to the emerging number of cases. And when they looked at high-risk workers, they had a prevalence of around about a quarter in those with highest exposures. And this led to an outright ban of engineered stone in Australia in 2024. And key features of the artificial stone silicosis being reported elsewhere is this very short latency of disease, so cases of acute and accelerated disease. And we know from data from Spain that 50% of those people who are exposed, who have silicosis from artificial stone, even when they stop exposure, will progress. So once you're diagnosed, if you stop exposure, 50% of people will remain static and 50% will get worse. And it's associated with a high mortality. And the other thing is the cases are largely arising in micro businesses, so businesses where there are probably fewer than 10 employees working in the processing part. They have poor health and safety controls, they have minimal use of water suppression, and in actual fact all the cases that I've seen have been dry processing, and they have no occupational health. So these are the sorts of slabs that come into the countries. And then this is a photograph from a plant that I went to, a factory I went to see. And you can see on the slab on the trolley there has got a hole cut out. And that process is called the finishing process. And it's where you're finishing off the slabs which have been cut to size. And you're putting in things like spaces for the hobs and for the sinks and the taps. So this is where the exposures are at the highest. So the big slabs come in and they're often cut into place by a sawyer and some sort of CNC machine, so an automated process which cuts them into size. But these finishing processes are where the problems arise. So the guy on the left of the screen has got an air-fed respirator on, and he's using a tool to polish, and he's got water suppression there. So he's using all the appropriate engineering controls to try and reduce his exposure to RCS. The guy on the right has got local exhaust ventilation there, which is the tube coming down. He's got water suppression. You can see the water coming off the table that he's polishing, but he's not got any respiratory protection on. And these pictures, I should say, are posted with consent, as are the following ones. So these are 2 of my patients. This is the conditions that they're working under. They're working in really poorly regulated workshops. They are absolutely covered with dust at the end of the day. There's dust on the floor, there's dust in their hair, and there's no doubt that their exposure limits are well above the exposure limit and are essentially illegal. So almost 12 months ago to the day, we wrote up a series of the first 8 cases that have been seen in the UK of artificial stone silicosis. It was 8 men, median age was 34, with the youngest being 27. 75% were born outside the UK. All of them had acquired their exposure to stone in the UK, and the majority had a history of smoking. Their median stone dust exposure was 12 years, with a range of 4 years, which is clearly in the acute silicosis range, up to 40 years. And I won't go through this in detail because I'm going to talk a bit more about the cases that we've seen now. But there were some key features which were very much in keeping with the story seen elsewhere. That was published in August last year. And we've now gone back and updated those numbers. So I think we're confident that there were no clear cases identified in the UK until mid-2023, but there were a couple of people who had probably in retrospect had artificial stone exposure and had presented with silicosis before that. So by the end of 2023, we'd had 4 cases. By the end of 2024, we'd got a cumulative total of 20 cases. And as of sort of last month, we've got 28 cases. So the 8 cases that I wrote up, we started to report this time last year. We're now on 28, if not a few more. All the cases bar 2, which have now been seen in Manchester, or maybe 3 or 4, depending on if they've turned up in clinic yet, have been seen in the clinical service that I work in at the Brompton. And interesting for us is that they're coming from lots of different places. So they come from several different consultants and hospitals across London and beyond. Many of them have been seen and looked after in sarcoid clinics. So sarcoidosis is another respiratory disease, which is for which has no obvious cause, but radiologically it looks identical to silicosis, and so we suspect there are many, many more cases of silicosis sitting in sarcoid clinics where nobody's taken an appropriate exposure history to determine that this may actually be a case of silicosis. And I saw a 40-year-old just like that this week. They've come from TB clinics, they've come from interstitial lung disease clinics. Most of them at the moment have come by word of mouth. So we have 3 patients in our clinic who have done an incredible job at expressing a wish to speak to the media. We've put absolutely zero pressure on them. They've all come to us and said, we would like to speak to the media and tell our story. And they have told their story. And then following on from media articles, people have approached us directly and said, I'm a stonemason, I'm worried I've got silicosis, please can you check me out? And Ryan at the bottom was just in the Sunday Times last weekend. And out of our original 8, 3 have died, and out of the 28 we've seen to date, several have been referred early for lung transplant. So these are the Brompton cases as of last month, and I'm sorry that I haven't put any sort of highlights on this to help, but essentially they're all men. They range from 24 to 58. About a quarter were born in the UK, a quarter in mainland Europe, and half outside of Europe. Most of them have got a smoking history. Median stone exposure is 11 years, with a range of 3 to 45. About 40% have only ever worked with artificial stones. So some have worked with other stones, like largely granite and marbles. And then as engineered stones become more popular in the UK, they've started to work with engineered stone. And all of them are dry cutting, so having those very high exposures. And CT appearances are very varied. So probably half have those chronic patterns that we saw earlier on, so the simple and the complicated. And the other half have got acute features, so they look like those acute silicoproteinosis cases. And it's quite challenging because there are lots of different ways that it presents radiologically. So we're having to think quite openly about their exposures and the disease in front of us and try and draw a causal link. For those of you who are interested in lung function, it's very broad. A lot of them have normal lung function, a lot of them have very poor lung function. But the key thing, I think, is that the gas transfer measurement is often very low. And we're seeing quite clear patterns. So a good proportion have lymphopenia, so a low white cell count. They almost all have a high serum ACE level, which is a blood test which we also use to diagnose sarcoid, again, which is where the confusion arrives. And about a third of them have positive ANA, so that's a blood test that we do to look for rheumatological conditions and connective tissue disease, and just concurs with what we know about silica exposure.